Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 62 of Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things. I'm one half of your host here. My name is Sean, here with my other co-host, Sam. Sam, how are you?
Doing well, Sean. How are you?
For the first time in my life, you were alive for the last one, but I was not. The Detroit Lions have won a playoff game, and I am over the moon. I don't know how to explain this feeling, which is being a part of a winner. It's just great. If you're a Michigan fan, undoubtedly you're probably a Lions fan as well. So this has been a pretty good 7 days here.
It's a good week for sports in Michigan. Yeah. You got the Lions' historic playoff win, and the great thing about it too is like you get to keep watching the Lions.
Yes,
right? And they get a home draw against
either Philadelphia or Tampa Bay, which is Tampa Bay is currently, as we're recording on this Monday, Tampa Bay is currently up like 10-0 against Philly. So, and it's a team we've already beaten in Tampa Bay, so that makes me even more excited.
Yeah.
Red Wings are doing well.
I think they won yesterday or the night before. I think they
won the last 2 days in a row.
They're on a huge point streak right now. Yeah. I think they got points in their entire trip out west.
Five or six games in a row. Yeah.
Yeah. I think they dropped one or two in overtime, but you still get points. And they won a couple in overtime, and I think they won outright most recently. And last then Michigan basketball, of all things.
I don't want to talk about
Michigan basketball. They've been terrible this year so far. I think they have now 4 wins. They beat Ohio State, which is, I think, it's not as big as the football rivalry, but it's always good to get a win.
We always say we're not a sports podcast, but Juwan Howard, man, what he's proved to me is that he can coach players, but he cannot recruit players. So
the unfortunate thing is
he did really well with Beeline, like all of the players that Beeline recruited.
Yes.
And now that it's been Juwan Howard's team, they look like shit.
Yeah. The roster management and just recruiting, retaining people, motivating his own son to play defense. It is a lot of questions there. And then it doesn't even touch on the personality stuff with specifically what seems like a pretty big anger management issue with him. Multiple altercations, suspensions, ejections.
He needs Andy Bernard's anger management class.
It's true.
And I just want to say, I feel sorry for the Michigan State fans that may or may not follow us. At least you have the Lions, I guess.
Yeah. Root for the Lions.
Yeah, root for the Lions.
But we're not here to talk about sports. As much fun as the sports are right now, we are here to talk about The Whisperer in Darkness, the second H.P. Lovecraft short story that we're covering. And Sean, over the past week, as we've been reading and preparing for this, you gave me the sense that you particularly liked this short story. And so I think I'll defer to you to summarize and kind of lead the discussion and throw in stuff as appropriate. But is that fair to say that you were a big fan of this one?
Yeah, I was. And this is a little bit longer of a short story as well. This one clocked in my book at around, I think it was like 110 pages-ish. Mm-hmm. And the Call of Cthulhu was only like 30 pages. So we're talking like 4 times more text for this one. But I really enjoyed it. I thought it was great. I actually powered through it and in like 2 days read it, which for me is a lot. I'm a pretty slow reader.
Yeah.
I've been reading a book on the Crusades for like 3 months and I'm only at like 210 pages. And I plowed through a 110-page short story in like 2 days. So,
it took me a little bit longer to chunk it out. I've been trying to get some other stuff done just around the house in the evenings or when I'm free from childcare. But once you get started with this stuff, you don't want to stop. It's really, despite his rather sophisticated language in many ways, it's eminently readable. And I know that that was one of the things that you wanted to talk about was kind of his style. But I have to agree with you. Like, you can pound through it. Like, I read Call of Cthulhu in one sitting. Obviously, it's a relatively short story, but it's like there is normally a bunch of other stuff that distracts me from reading, especially reading non-work related items. And with these past couple of short stories, like, yeah, I don't want to put it down. I'm going to stay up later than I normally would. I'm going to knock these out. So yeah, very easy read, very enjoyable read.
So The Whisper in Darkness, here's my very short summarization of the plot. So spoilers, if you haven't read the short story yet, we would advise you to pause, go back and read the short story, and then come back to us. The story picks up in tales of flooding in Vermont, and there are sightings of these pink creatures floating in the floodwaters coming down from the Vermont hills. Our protagonist takes those stories and begins to find that there is a similarity in multiple reports across a geographic area of Vermont, that he begins to think that, maybe all of these are more than just coincidence, that maybe they're onto something. As he delves into it a little bit deeper, he starts to get letters from an individual who lives in Vermont, a learned man who lives on a farm, in a farmhouse in the middle of the Vermont hills. And they begin to have a correspondence where the person living in Vermont, Mr. Akeley, I believe is his name, begins to divulge information that there are indeed beings living in the Vermont hills, that he has interacted with them, and that he's beginning to fear for his life. A correspondence between the two continues, culminating in a recording of these creatures' speech, and to the point of Mr. Akeley is shooting at them at night. They approach his farmhouse, they find tracks. His dogs are kind of fending off these creatures from attacking the farmhouse, and his dogs are also being killed in the process. And our protagonist or Mr. Akeley has to go into town, resupply. He believes that there are individuals working for these creatures, and it culminates in a letter from Akeley saying, "I most likely will not survive the night. If you don't hear from me, that means that they have killed me or taken me. Please let my son in, I think it's San Diego, know that basically I love him." It's like let my son know what happened to me. Our protagonist goes to the farm after receiving a letter from Mr. Akeley saying that he has communicated with these beings, that they have divulged like the mysteries of the universe to him. And if he would just come to the farm with the supplies and the pictures and the recording that he took, then everything will be okay. He'll also gain the knowledge that these creatures have given to him, and then they will go off, presumably on an interstellar travel. Our protagonist goes, has a very weird conversation with a Mr. Akeley where he is presumed to have asthma and he is sick. And then he goes upstairs to sleep for the night, only to come downstairs in the middle of the night to discover one of the so-called double agents for the aliens sleeping on the couch, and an empty chair where Mr. Akeley had been sitting, but only to uncover Mr. Akeley's face and hands. And they leave it up to kind of interpretation that the hands were either so skillfully sculpted in face that they were just amazing works of art, or they were the actual face and hands of Akeley. Am I correct in that assumption?
I think it's significant. It's vague enough. Yeah, it could be his hands that have been removed from his body. It could be, as you, I think he describes them being as if they were sculpted from wax. That could be a metaphor. That could be a factual statement. I think the idea is that he sees it so briefly and is in such a state of
Shock.
shock that he just, he runs away and doesn't really, he doesn't investigate.
Yeah. And the whole point of this travel is your brain has to be removed from its body and put into this like cylinder to survive the trip. But there are mechanisms that can be attached to the cylinder so the brain can still communicate and speak. So in the instance when he's talking with Akeley the night before, he talks to a brain in a jar who I don't remember if we get details on who this brain is.
I don't
but
recall if it was named. Yeah.
It's an individual that has taken apparently this trip multiple times and has seen other stars in other galaxies and yeah, is just a human. But we end the story with our protagonist having left all of those materials behind and getting in a car and then leaving. And then when the police show up the next day, the farmhouse is empty, minus the bullet holes in the walls. But it was a lot. And like I said, I really, really enjoyed this short story. And I thought it did a really good job of keeping me on my toes, the suspense up. And what I found these are the first two stories that we've read by Lovecraft, between Call of Cthulhu and this. I think Lovecraft does a really, really great job of using the realism from the time and kind of just building his cultish stories into a real situation. And with this one, he kind of plays up like that cryptozoology of there being beings living in the hills of Vermont, like folklore and things like that. And then takes it to another step. And then it makes it more believable, more real, more terrifying that he takes things that people already believe in and then he enhances them to a point of invoking fear in the other. And that's kind of his big concept.
I think one of his, the narrator, was it Wilmarth, is a professor or something. Is he a pretty
he's pretty well known in New England.
Yeah. And he's a folklore expert, I think, was part of his training. And he kind of ties back these aliens or these creatures, whatever they are at that point, with legends from around the world of things like the Yeti, the abominable snowman, in the Himalayas. And I think that was actually was that the brain in the cylinder? It was like, I first met them in the Himalayas. I think that comes full circle. So like it's at the beginning, it's conjecture on Wilmarth's part that, all of these sightings are so similar, it could be the same thing. And then he's kind of trying to rationalize like what could be the explanation. But then at the end of the story, you kind of get full circle. We're like, no, like this brain in a jar says, I met them in the Himalayas. And so you confirm the fact that, yes, these are linked. And the truth is that it's just this alien race.
Mm-hmm. And for the most part, they're coming to Earth because there is a specific rock that they're trying to mine to send back. And that's the other thing too. He takes all of these folklore stories, but he also ties in the discovery of Pluto.
Yeah, which happened the year before this came out, which is, it's so funny for us because now Pluto, it's technically not a planet. Neil deGrasse Tyson became famous around this in part. And back then it was literally a year before he wrote this. Talk about a ninth planet was, maybe there were some ideas that it was out there or something like that, but you could kind of fill in the blank. It could be this semi-mythical thing. And then it actually happens. And Lovecraft was an amateur astronomer, and really, like, that was one of his early passions, was astronomy. And so, he was all over that announcement and when it came out. And I think this comes out, and I watched a documentary or like a Nova episode with Neil deGrasse Tyson about Pluto, and he kind of did a tour of the US after it lost its planetary designation. And he was trying to understand why there was so much pushback. And he's like, Pluto was the only planet discovered by an American. And it was discovered within this century. We're less than 100 years from the discovery of Pluto. And you look at, a lot of the other planets, we've known about them since prehistory, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you had this very interesting time when in the story you could have this character Wilmarth like talking about conjectures about a ninth planet, and then in the same story talk about Pluto as this confirmed ninth planet, and just try to tie it all together to this like strange understanding of these aliens, to the point where he's like, is there a conspiracy started by the aliens to name this ninth planet Pluto, because Pluto's the god of the underworld and it's supposed to be
Mm-hmm.
kind of little nefarious or diabolical.
Yeah, I mean, I just came away from this really enjoying the short story, and then I had only read Call of Cthulhu, but this has opened up. I'm so interested to read the other stories now.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this was number 1 on the ranking list that I shared with you.
Mm.
So I think we're starting pretty high.
Yeah.
By doing Call of Cthulhu and this. So I'm interested to see where we go from here and how his style kind of differs with other things. But these first two, I mean, to me, knocked it out of the park. I've really enjoyed both of them so far.
One thing I really like about this is it's the epistolary style for a lot of it, where you have the kind of back and forth of him recalling the letters and the telegrams that Ackley and he exchanged, which I mean, unfortunately, I don't know enough about Gothic horror to say if this was true for other stories, but famously Dracula is an epistolary novel. And, it starts with letters between Jonathan Harker and Mina Harker. And it's got, I think, newspaper clippings and excerpts from the journal of the captain of the Demeter, which, by the way, have you seen The Last Voyage of the Demeter yet?
No, it's on my list to watch, though.
Yeah, I keep trying to get Haley to watch it. She was like, entertained it for a second, and then no, we ended up watching Oppenheimer instead, which was awesome in its own right. But yeah, so that's where I'm familiar with the epistolary novel, is Bram Stoker's Dracula. But it's really effective because it's such a good way to heighten the suspense, right? Like, I don't know about you, but one of the reasons that I kept reading was because like, oh my God, like I could get a sense of this Ackley guy in this house all by himself with his dogs, like shooting into the woods at these unknown creatures. And he goes and sees the footprints, and he, is getting increasingly desperate. And then you have the narrator talking about how like he had to restrain himself from going out there to try and help. And it was just and then the other layer is that, that all of this is buffered in time. And they even make reference to how some of their letters arrived before, after they'd already sent another letter, right? And then letters start going missing, and all this fun stuff.
Agents who work for the beings that are interfering with their correspondence.
Yeah.
And there's even the whole discussion about that like black stone pillar that Ackley tries to send, and then it ends up getting stolen in the process, and all of this. Yeah.
Yeah, you just think about it too. It is such an artifact of its time, and you think about the 20s and 30s. And there was so much. We're right at the cusp of this modern age, where they're still writing letters and sending telegrams, but there's also a telephone. But the telephone cord keeps getting cut. Right, that's part of the sabotage and the attacks. But they don't talk on the phone ever. That you can't make long distance calls. You can just make local calls to the sheriff or into town or whatever, as far as Ackley is concerned. And then
he gets a recording on
he gets
on a record.
a wax recording. Yeah, that was such a fun like throwback thing. And you just know that if somebody tried to write the story in 2024, it would all be about cell phones and uploading videos and taking pictures and sending them directly to people and doing a FaceTime with the aliens and whatever else. But now, because of you have these technological advancement to have relatively rapid communication, as in the telegram, and relatively rapid transportation, so the train and then the cars. But it's not to the point where it's like, let's
instantaneous.
It's not instantaneous. You can't rent a helicopter and go to the top of the mountain. Right. He doesn't drive his own car there because he doesn't own a car, because it's 1930 and not everybody owns a car. And then, he jumps in the Ford to escape, right? Model T or a Model A Ford. And so it's just such a fun artifact of its time. And then the whole Pluto thing is so great. And that like only a story published in 1931 could reference this newly discovered ninth planet and be legitimate, like actually talking about the newly discovered ninth planet.
Mm-hmm. And I had mentioned before we started recording that it gave me, or his writing style gives me like a recall to War of the Worlds being published, or not published, but the radio play, and how that caused an actual uproar amongst listeners thinking that there was an actual like alien invasion from Mars. And his style is it's based in such realism that, and like we said earlier, like the references to folklore and things that people actually believe in, and then kind of interweaving his cosmic horror into stuff that is already known in the world, just creates such a real and vivid story that, yeah, I kept wanting to know what happened. And personally, I think Ackley is dead and there's nefarious goings on with these aliens. And that's what I think they lead you to believe, because at one point when our protagonist is trying to sleep that night, he's at the farmhouse, he hears a conversation of the buzzing aliens and the brain in the jar. And the brain in the jar sounds put off and defensive and frightened. And he even says when he goes to leave the next morning, there's another brain in a jar who he believes to be Ackley's. And he regrets and is also thankful that he didn't turn the machine on to talk to it for fear of what it would say. And just that alone, like that, just leaving it there, I was like, oh my God, yeah. How terrifying would it have been had he turned it on and listened to Ackley's brain, like divulge all of this information to you? And that, like everything that he goes into, it's the concept of the human brain can't comprehend, like the horror of these happenings. And would our protagonist have been able to survive the horror of the realization of what was actually happening to Ackley? And I don't know, I was just thrilled by it. I thought it was a great story.
Yeah, that last, I mean, there's so many like little details in the last section that you're just like, no, like don't do it. It's because it starts with, they've exchanged letters this entire time. And he describes his handwriting and he's trying to recall what the letter said. And then the last communication he gets before visiting is a telegram, which, telegram, there's no handwriting to decipher. And he even remarked about how the spelling, things were spelled differently and types of vocabulary were different. And he ties it back to being a professor. And he's like, I can tell that certain styles of authors have, and this was very different from all the other letters that he'd received. And then he kind of attributes it to this change in, the change in his relationship with these aliens as described in the telegram. But the reader knows like something bad has happened, something very bad has happened. If he even sent that telegram at all, it probably didn't. It was probably the noise guy, Noyes. Yeah.
And that was one of the criticisms of the story that I had found, was you have this, what appears to be like this super intelligent person, yet in the end, he's so gullible to just believe that this was Ackley, and to just bring all of the evidence that Ackley had sent him back to the farmhouse, only for it to be like taken or destroyed or whatever happened to it. And I get that, like that is pretty shitty, but
yeah, you kind of had to come up with a way to like, you got to get him to you have to get him into the room to have this like final confrontation, or you had to get him to the house, and then you have to destroy the evidence. And so there's a certain logic to why Lovecraft decided to write it that way, and I get that. I think my one, suspension of disbelief, I guess, is that there were explanations for the things that would naturally give you, like, raise your suspicions. And I think the narrator even says, like, I wasn't fully convinced, but I was, convinced enough that I wanted to like go and see and talk to him. And he said he brought a revolver, right? So he knew that there was a potential that things were not exactly what they seemed. And I think there were a couple moments where it's like, again, a modern interpretation of this is like, oh, there's just like too much stuff that you would have to like, oh, like all of the explanations for why Ackley is in the dark and completely wrapped up and looks really weird. It's like, oh, it's asthma, right? It's like, oh, really? When you get asthma, you have to like completely, sit in the dark and wrap yourself in bandages
After you've already discovered that the creatures don't do well in the sunlight.
Exactly. Like, yeah, there's
and
a lot of things that
told you that. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I love the little detail about the coffee having like an acrid taste.
Acrid smell, I think, because he never drinks it.
He never, I couldn't, I
read he believes that that's what saved him, because if he would have drank the water, he would have been whatever, drugged or.
Yeah. And probably he would have woken up as a brain in a jar, right? Something like that. And then just that whole idea of the brain in the jar is such a fun image. And I'm just thinking, I recently played Baldur's Gate 3, the video game, and mind flayers play a very significant central role in that video game. As they're this great D&D villain, and they're all about eating brains and turning people into thralls and doing all this stuff. And I think we mentioned Lovecraft as being one of the inspirations for a lot of the D&D stuff. And that whole brain in a jar thing is like straight out of D&D. It's literally happens in Baldur's Gate 3. Some of the first items that you can pick up in the game are brains in jars. And later in the game,
I haven't played it yet, so don't.
Well, okay, that's not a spoiler.
Divulge too much.
It's not a spoiler, but later in the game, minor spoiler, you can connect those brains from literally like the demo level. You can connect them to a device and talk to them. And it's just fun that 90 years ago this was being described in a short story. Yeah, it was a really fun read. And you didn't have a ton of that signature H.P. Lovecraft racism. Maybe a little bit here and there, but
it was harder to detect in this one for sure.
Yeah.
And there are references to other eldritch beings, like they reference Cthulhu or the cults of Cthulhu anyway, and a couple of the other elder gods that Lovecraft writes about. But it didn't really it didn't have that feel. It had more of like a sci-fi horror
very much
than it did like cultish eldritch horror. But out of how many elder gods would you give this? Let's say there's 5 elder gods.
I'd give this a 5 out of 5. This was a great short story. Again, it's short and it reads fast, and you don't want to put it down. You could read this in one sitting easily. And yeah, it's really fun. It'll have you on the edge of your seat, and it's a great little sting of horror at the end.
I'd go 4.5.
Okay.
I'm not ready to give it a full 5. It might change my vote later after I read more short stories by Lovecraft. But if this is the reviewer that I found, so that this was his best one, I guess we'll have to see. I'll have to read some more. Because Call of Cthulhu, to me, I would rank it probably like a 3 now compared to this one. I liked the themes that Call of Cthulhu introduces, and I hope that other short stories build upon those themes. But this one is like a standalone story. This was pretty well flushed out, like beginning, middle, end. This is a great one-off. And I did read the person who was talking about this being the best Lovecraft. They said, do not watch the movie. Apparently there is a Whisper in Darkness movie that is horrible, and that we should avoid it at all costs because the story is great, but the movie was not.
I think, unfortunately, well, I had the Wikipedia page open because I didn't know how we'd want to do the plot summary, and there's a couple of different adaptations. Let's see. Oh, this should be interesting. In December 2019, BBC Radio 4 aired an adaptation of The Whisperer in Darkness as part of the Lovecraft investigations, taking the form of a modern-day true crime podcast. That could be kind of interesting, but let's see here. Is it the YouTube video, the short film? Because that came out in 2023.
No, it'd probably be
There's a
earlier than that. But
all right.
it just says,
There's a bunch of different adaptations. I might just be jumping around too much here to find it.
yeah, it just says avoid the movie at all costs. So there must be like a actual film that was created, and we can look into it. Maybe we'll watch it and talk about it later.
It seems like there have been a couple of these film versions of Lovecraft stories. Let's see. The H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society produced a film version made like a 1930s horror film, which premiered at the 2011 Seattle International Film Festival. I think Call of Cthulhu was also had a similar treatment. So I wonder if that type of approach is common for a couple of these, at least some of these short stories, and maybe that's what's being referenced if it actually was released.
Well, that leads us to discussing what we're going to cover next week. I think we should do the short story, The Color Out of Space.
All right, let's do it.
Only because, as I said last week, that was one of the more recent films that I watched.
Mm-hmm.
So we could talk about the story and then give the film a go and then talk about the film. If that tweaks your interest at all.
It does. Do you want to do the film and the short story in the same podcast, or have two podcasts covering them?
Up to you. I've already watched the movie, so I'm good to go. If you want to read the story, okay, then let's do both next week.
Let's read the story and then we'll talk about the movie and the story in the same podcast.
If we go too long, we might have to make it a two-parter, which is okay.
All right. Color Out of Space.
If you're following along, that's what we'll be covering next week. This has been Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things, episode 62. You can go back and listen to the other 61 episodes on all different platforms. Start from episode 1 and then go all the way through. That is your homework. You can email us at elvesringsnerdythings@gmail.com. You can follow us on Facebook, Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things. We have a Facebook group, Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things podcast. Let us know if there's anything you'd be interested in us talking about or talking about with us. If you know any famous people who are in the realm of Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things, give us their contact info and we'll heckle them until they agree to come on for an interview. Sam, you have anything else you want to say before we close out?
Go Lions, go.
Go Lions, go. Bye, everybody.
Bye.